Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon. I think it's worth recalling upfront where the sector inquiry started with two main allegations, namely that companies misused the patent system to delay generic access and misused the patent system to hinder innovation. When you look at the communication which was approved today, none of these allegations has been substantiated. The fastest access for generics, and we saw this already in the preliminary report, is in Germany, the biggest market, and the fastest access you have in markets for the biggest products. The slowest access is in Luxembourg. It already shows that commercial factors play a major role. And it also actually, the other element, which was by and large ignored in the preliminary report and now better balanced in the communication, it always ignored the role of regulation, the role of administrative delays. What we also see is that generics actually got fast access over time. In the communication, we now for the first time see a reference to the introduction of BOLAR, which means you can do preparatory work pre-patent expiry in Europe rather than outside Europe. That only came into force in 2005. I think the same in terms of no substantiation of the allegation, and even stronger could be said for the allegation of industry hindering innovation. We have had many comments from people who had followed the industry for many years who really were surprised that this allegation was ever made. When you look into the communication, you hardly see any reference to that allegation. Initially, there was the talk about 99 requests for licenses, of which actually 4 out of 5 were granted. There was a reference that one project was dropped. Actually, now there's a talk of several projects dropped or had to be worked around it, which may read somewhat nicer than one project out of 99, but certainly not much substance in there. Having said that, I think we certainly welcome the communication in terms of a change of tone, communication maybe rather than the press release and what we heard this morning. And we also welcome it in terms of a change of balance and differences of emphasis. When we look at the communication, the 28 pages released today, the main conclusions from our side, and we welcome that, is there's now full recognition of the importance of intellectual property rights for the promotion of innovation and for competitiveness in Europe. There's also recognition that regulation and administrative hurdles play a role, actually play a major role. And we see a much better balance between access delays and the talk about access delays on the one hand, and competition or efficient competition in the off-patent market in general. There's still a reference to the €3 billion, which supposedly could be saved if you would reach the market on day one, which is a purely hypothetical assumption. But when you put this in perspective again, looking at the €450 per capita on the year spent, this would amount to less than €1 per capita, less than 0.2% of pharmaceutical spending. A major role of the sector investigation looked at intellectual property rights and the defense of patent rights. Therefore, I think it's important to state that upfront and throughout the report, we now find full recognition of the importance of strong patents, in particular for pharmaceutical innovation throughout the report. We complained, and I think said so in many fora, conferences, and also in our written submission, that we felt the preliminary report contained negative language. When you look at the report to communication now, this language has significantly changed. In particular, I draw your attention to the paragraph on terminology, which one can find on page 5 of the report. The notion of the toolbox, which was very controversial, has been dropped altogether, at least in the communication. We haven't seen the full 600-page report yet. I couldn't find it once. There was a lot of talk about primary, secondary patents, defensive patents, patent cluster, patent thickets. Actually, now it's stated very clearly that one should not have any negative connotation with any of these terms. It's now in the chapter on terminology. And it's also said very clearly that the notion of defensive patents should not be understood to mean that these patents are of a lower quality or value. Actually, defense of patents, said by the Commission in the communication, is inherent in granting patent rights. It's also said very clearly that the Commission recognizes that patents, and therefore defending patents, means defending our assets. It means defending innovation. And on page 11 of the communication, you can see that it is absolutely legitimate to enforce patent rights in courts. Now, having read the 430-page preliminary report last November, actually the implied assumption reading it that most of these defensive measurements were somewhat, shady. Now, restating it, probably at the request of many of the experts, starting with the European Patent Office, I think is an important change of tone as well as of content. In November, it was said that regulation is outside the remit of the sector investigation. Therefore, we are pleased to note that a significant part of the communication is now about the role of regulation, about administrative hurdles, and quite a number of recommendations now address member states, and we see reference to the importance of regulation at length. Looking at the main policy recommendations, we are pleased to note that the two main ones on patents and patent regulation, in terms of community patent, specialized unified patent litigation, and also improving processes in the European Patent Offices and streamlining some of these processes, those are the ones where we as an industry said all along that we actually welcome and support these recommendations. And we have worked and continue to work very constructively with the relevant services in the Commission and the European Patent Office to improve and to make these work. Therefore, we also pleased to note that the Swedish presidency said that they put this high up on the agenda of their presidency. We do welcome the focus in terms of the shift of focus in terms of looking at regulation and administrative procedures in access delays for not only generic drugs, but also for innovative originator medicines. We have complained for many years that European patients have to wait far too long until they have access to innovation. We also welcome the shift of focus to the nature of competition in off-patent market. And therefore the recommendation not only for speedy reimbursement of generics, but also explicit reference to the respect of the timelines included in Transparency Directive for innovative medicines. But also the notion that there should be more competition, and the role of competition in the off-patent market is very important, because European patients do deserve better than what they have now. It is quite clear, and this was a significant part of the press conference this morning, that we cannot possibly comment on individual cases. And I'd like to emphasize again that, as the Commissioner said this morning, individual cases are outside the remit of the sector investigation. What we as an industry looked at is whether there are systemic flaws in the system. There we feel vindicated that actually the communication is now much more balanced. Regarding the emphasis on looking at settlement agreements, I'd still like to make a couple of points. I noticed that the Commission recognizes that such agreements have to be analyzed case by case. I also noticed that the somewhat simplistic assumption, which means that settlement agreements with reverse payments are outright bad, has been dropped because there's an emphasis on case by case. And I also noticed, reading the communication, that the vast majority of agreements appear to be the result of litigation, which indicates that most of them, all of them, are the result of genuine disputes. And I'd like to refer in this context to the guidelines of the Commission on technology transfer, which recognize that early settlement agreements are pro-competitive if there's a genuine dispute. Therefore, having listened to the comments this morning, I think it's important to add. In conclusion and in short, We welcome the recognition of the importance of this industry for health in Europe and for the competitiveness of Europe, and in particular the importance of strong IPRs for this industry and for innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. We saw again that the allegations have not been substantiated. We welcome the difference in tone, the better balance and the difference in content, and in particular the appropriate focus on the role of regulation. And we also support the call for speedy access of generics as well as of innovative medicines. And we also can endorse broadly the policy recommendations, which we see as very constructive. And in that respect, we hope that we can continue to engage and continue the constructive dialogue we have had with Commission services throughout these 18 months. Thank you.